Alright, before we start, in case you're wondering, the screen is completely black on purpose, so don't panic. The video isn't broken. I'm actually reading from a script, so I can actually say everything the way I want to say it. Because, I don't really do good with, like speaking long sentences, especially 25 paragraphs. But this is a book, a fan-made book I call, well, not really fan-made, it's made on my own, called Maturity. Let's get into it. Growing up is a strange thing. People often talk about maturity like it's a single destination you arrive at. Like one day everything suddenly clicks and you understand life completely. But that's not really how it feels. It feels more like figuring things out while you're already in the middle of them. Moments where you react before you fully understand what you feel. Moments where you think about what you said afterward and realize it could have come out differently. Moments where you start noticing that not everyone experiences the same situation in the same way. And over time, those moments start to shape how you see people, conversations, and even yourself. But this isn't just a book about growing up in a general sense. It's also about something more specific. It's also about how people, especially younger people like teenagers, start forming boundaries. Not rules for other people, but limits for themselves. And ways they try to make sense of how they're treated, how they're spoken to, and how conversations feel in real life. Sometimes towards their parents most of the time. It's also about how a lot of 13-year-olds think while they're trying to figure out all of that out at the same time. Because at that age, you're not just learning how the world works, you're also learning how you kind of fit into it. And sometimes those two things don't line up neatly. So, this audiobook is about that space in between. 100 pages, which are actually not paper pages, and they're not even words on a screen, they're just blank, black screens that make them sound like pages, but aren't actually pages at all. Between understanding others, understanding yourself, and figuring out what you're okay with as you grow. That's what this book is about. This is maturity, and this is where it begins. A lot of the time, boundaries don't start as something formal or planned. They start as feelings. A moment where something doesn't sit right. A moment where a conversation feels too repetitive, intense, or just harder than it needs to be. And at first, you don't always know what to do with that feeling. So you try different things. You explain yourself again. You adjust how you say things. You try to find a version of the conversation that feels like it makes sense to both sides at the same time. But sometimes, even after all of that, it still doesn't land the way you expected. And that's usually when people start thinking about limits. Well, not like limits in the sense of controlling other people, but limits in the sense of understanding what kind of situations feel okay to stay in and what kinds start to feel overwhelming. Because every person has a different point where something starts to feel like too much, even if the situation itself seems small from the outside. And part of growing up is noticing where those points are for yourself. Not to avoid responsibility, but to understand your own reactions better, so you can respond instead of just reacting. And that's where boundaries begin to form. Quietly at first, without a label, just from experience. Sometimes boundaries show up most clearly in conversations that don't go the way you expected. Not because something huge happens, but because a small moment starts repeating itself in a way that feels stuck. Like a question getting asked again and again, even after it has already been answered. Or a topic circling back when you thought it had already been finished. And at some point, the focus shifts away from the original point and into how the conversation feels while it keeps going. That's usually when frustration starts to build on both sides. One person feels like they're not being heard clearly. The other person, they feel like they're being pushed too far or repeated to the point where it becomes draining. And in that space, neither side usually feels fully understood in the moment. That's part of why boundaries matter. Because they aren't always about stopping a conversation completely. Sometimes they're just about recognizing when a conversation is no longer being productive for either person and needing space for it to reset. Not as a punishment, not as a way to win, but as a way to keep things from turning into something worse than they need to be. And learning that takes time and patience. Because in the middle of emotion, it's not always easy to step back and see the pattern forming. Over time, you do start to notice it, but noticing it is usually the first step towards handling it differently. A lot of the time when I think about these boundaries, I notice they usually show up most clearly between kids and parents. Because that's where one of the first real places where rules and expectations exist in everyday life. And it's also where people start learning that not every rule feels the same to the person following it. Some rules make complete sense right away. They exist for safety, structure, responsibility, or just because somebody needs to be in charge of a situation. And in those cases, there isn't really a vote involved. It's more about understanding and following what's needed. But not every situation feels that simple all the time. Sometimes what matters is how things are being communicated, or how repeated situations start to feel over time. And that's where boundaries come into the picture. Not as a way to override rules or take away control from anyone, but as a way of recognizing how certain patterns of interaction affect how somebody feels during conversations or disagreements. For teenagers especially, this could become something they start to notice more clearly as they grow, especially me. Because they're old enough to understand more, but still learning how to handle situations where they don't have equal control over decisions. So instead of thinking about it as rules versus no rules, it becomes more about understanding when something is a necessary rule, or when something might just be a pattern of communication that needs to be handled in a calmer or clearer way. And that's usually where the idea of boundaries starts to feel more real. Not as rebellion, but as awareness of how interactions actually feel over time. Now, when teenagers start talking about these boundaries, especially between teenagers and parents, it can sometimes sound like it's about control or who gets to decide what. But it usually isn't that simple. It's more about how somebody chooses to engage in situations based on how those situations feel to them over time. For a lot of teenagers, boundaries show up in how they respond during conversations that feel repetitive, intense, or unproductive. Not as a way to take authority away from anybody else, but as a way of deciding what they will or won't engaging with, or as a way of deciding what they will or won't keep engaging with in the same way. That might look like stepping away from a conversation for a moment, choosing not to keep responding, so ignoring, or waiting until things feel calmer before continuing. From the outside, that can sometimes look like shutting things down. But from the inside, it can feel more like trying to avoid a situation getting more heated than it already is. Or trying to deheat it. And in those moments, communication changes. Because a conversation usually needs both people actively participating to continue in the same way. If one side stops engaging, then the direction of the conversation just naturally shifts or slows down. Which does not mean either side wins or loses anything. It just means the interaction is no longer happening in the same form. Parents especially sometimes feel like they're supposed to have full control over how a conversation continues because of their role. But as teenagers grow, they start to make more decisions about how they personally respond in conversations, even if they don't control the rules of the situation itself. And that difference can create misunderstandings. Because one person may expect a conversation to continue normally, while the other person is choosing to pause or step back from it. So it becomes less about overriding anything, and more about learning that engagement itself is something both sides contribute to in different ways. And that's part of what boundaries are really connected to. Not control, but participation, response, and personal limits within a situation. If parents are watching or listening to this section is mainly aimed in your direction. Not in the sense that teenagers can't listen to it or understand it, because they can. but in the sense that the perspective here is meant to help explain what certain teenage behaviors can look like from the inside, so they make more sense from the outside. A lot of the rest of the book is more centered on how teenagers think and experience situations. But this page, put that in air quotes, is more focused on helping parents understand what those moments might mean, instead of only what they look like. There's also something that happens during the teenage years that a lot of parents eventually run into. It can show up during arguments, stressful conversations, or moments where emotions are already high. And in those moments, strong things can be said. Really bad things. Sometimes it can sound like anger, rejection, or even statements that feel very final in the moment. But what's happening underneath is often emotional overload. Teenagers don't always process strong emotions into carefully filtered words in real time. Instead, the intensity of what they feel can come out directly without much adjustment. That can make the words sound bigger than the actual long-term meaning behind them. And it's important to understand that this stage is not usually permanent. As people grow, those reactions tend to change. Communication gets clearer, and emotional responses become more controlled over time. So even if something sounds very extreme in the moment, it doesn't always reflect something lasting or fully settled. A lot of the time, it's just a snapshot of emotion, not a final conclusion. And looking at it that way can help separate temporary reactions from long-term meaning. Because one is a moment of intensity, and the other is how somebody actually feels over time. Continuing from that idea, it helps to separate two things that often get mixed together in real conversations: rules and boundaries. Rules are usually things set to guide behavior in a shared environment. Things like needing to do homework, following routines, or handling responsibilities. They exist to keep structure in place, and they apply to what somebody is expected to do. Boundaries are different. Boundaries are more about how someone chooses to respond within a situation. For example, stepping away from a conversation when it feels too intense, deciding not to continue engaging in a repetitive argument, or choosing to wait until things are calmer before responding. They are not about controlling what someone else does. They're about managing personal response. And that distinction matters because rules and boundaries operate in different directions. Rules are usually about expectations placed in a situation. Boundaries are about limits placed on participation in that situation. In teenagers especially, boundaries can become more noticeable because emotions and independence are both developing at the same time. So when a teenager says something like they're not going to engage in a conversation the same way anymore, it's not about rejecting authority in general. It's more about how they are choosing to handle a specific interaction. At the same time, parents also have boundaries of their own, even if they don't always label them that way. Everyone does. But boundaries don't cancel each other out, and they don't override rules in different sets either. Instead, they exist alongside them, affecting how people interact within those rules. And when those two things clash, rules on one side and boundaries on the other, it can feel like neither side fully has control over the interaction in the moment. Which is why these moments often come down to communication, not control. Because both sides are still deciding how they will participate, even if they are doing it in very different ways. And understanding that difference is usually where things start to make more sense over time. There are also moments in communication where something gets repeated more than once. Sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's a concern, and sometimes it's a topic that keeps coming back even after it has already been answered. This mainly happens in teenagers, usually with anxiety. From the outside, that repetition can look simple. It can look like someone not listening or not accepting the answer that was already given. But from the inside, it can feel different. Sometimes repeating a question comes from uncertainty. Sometimes it comes from anxiety. And sometimes it comes from trying to fully understand something that doesn't feel fully understood yet, even if it has already been explained. That doesn't automatically make the behavior easy to deal with in the moment. Repetition can still be tiring, especially in a conversation that is already feeling tense or stretched out. But it's important to separate behavior from intent, because those two are not always the same thing. Repeating a question may be annoying behavior, but it doesn't automatically mean cruel intent. And that difference really matters. Because if somebody assumes the intent is negative, the entire tone of the conversation can change very quickly. But if the behavior is understood as confusion, stress, or uncertainty, then the response to it can also change. Instead of becoming more intense, it can sometimes become more patient or more structured. And that shift can completely change how the conversation feels for both sides. So part of communication isn't just responding to what's being said, but also trying to understand why it might be being said again. And that is something that becomes easier with awareness over time. Boundaries become more noticeable when they start to affect how a conversation continues in real time. Not as a way to control what somebody else says, but as a way to change how someone else chooses to respond when they feel a pattern repeating. One of the clearest examples of this is how people respond to respect in conversations. Because respect isn't only about tone or words in a single moment. It's also about whether the overall interaction feels fair, balanced, and calm over time. So sometimes a boundary is not really about doing the same thing back. It's more about choosing not to continue engaging in a situation that feels one-sided or consistently negative. For example, and I have this boundary too, if a conversation starts to feel like one person is being spoken to harshly or unfairly over and over again, a boundary might show up in how they respond next. Not necessarily by escalating it, but instead by changing how much they participate in it. So instead of continuing the same pattern, like if you're treating them with no respect, they won't treat you with any, they may step back, pause, or respond differently than before. The idea behind that isn't punishment, it's self-regulation. It's the decision not to keep engaging in a way that feels draining or unproductive. And this is where boundaries can sometimes be misunderstood, because from one side it might look like somebody is refusing to continue the conversation. But from the other side, it can feel like they're simply choosing not to stay in a dynamic. It can feel like they're simply choosing not to stay in a dynamic that doesn't feel respectful to them. And that distinction is very important, because boundaries are not always about what others are doing. They are often about what someone else is no longer willing to participate in the same way. And once that shift happens, the conversation naturally changes shape. Not because one side wins, but because the interaction itself has been adjusted. Now listen, boundaries don't always exist as one single idea. They build over time. Through different situations, different conversations, and different reactions to how people treat each other in real life. So, instead of this being a single conclusion, this is more like the end of a first section of ideas, a starting point. Because understanding communication, emotions, rules, and boundaries isn't something that happens all at once. It develops in parts. And each part adds a little more clarity than the last. So this is the end of part 1 of maturity. Not the end of the topic itself. This might go to like 10 or 20 parts, which will be a very long series. But it's just a pause before continuing further. Because everything discussed so far connects to what comes next. And the next part continues exploring on how these ideas show up in real situations, and how they change depending on context, relationships, and personal experience. This series will continue, and each section will build on the one before it. Nothing here is meant to stand alone completely, because understanding people doesn't really work that way. It happens step by step, part by part, and this is only the beginning. Part 2 will continue soon, and each part that follows will add more depth to the same overall idea. So if you're following along, each section matters. Please watch every part if you can, because each one adds another piece to the full picture. And the goal is not to rush through it, but to understand as it develops. Thanks for watching.